Hello there. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. As you probably know, artificial intelligence can be incredibly useful. It underpins a lot of the products that we rely on every day, like Google search and social networking sites like Twitter and Instagram. But depending on a host of factors, such as how it's built and what kind of data is used, who's building it, and what it's meant to do, AI can also pose really big security and privacy problems and perpetuate injustices as well. Research in numerous real life events show how facial recognition systems, for instance, can be incredibly harmful to individuals' lives if someone is wrongfully arrested based on an incorrect face match, for instance. And today, we're going to talk about some of the societal impacts of AI and what it means to design AI that can be used responsibly. So please welcome our panelists. First, we have Heather Dowdy, who's a Senior Program Manager of AI and Accessibility at Microsoft. We have Susan Gonzales, CEO at AINU, Mona Sloane, who's a fellow at the Institute for Public Knowledge, and Julia Stoyanovich, NYU Center for Data Science and NYU Center for Responsible AI at NYU Tandon School of Engineering. And I'm Rachel Metz. I'm a senior writer at CNN Business, where I cover AI. I'll be moderating our discussion today, and thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all for joining us. Let's start with a question about companies that are using AI in their products. Equity and ethics in AI seem to be much more top of mind recently, such as in the past couple of years, than it has been prior to that. But we've been designing and using AI systems for so much longer. Why do you think that is?
Hi, Rachel. Thanks for getting us started. I think what's happening is that people, basically every company in every industry at this point, pretty much is using some form of AI. And I think that what's happening at the same time is that we, communities overall, but especially the underrepresented communities, don't really understand that we're touching AI every day. You know, use GPS, use Siri, shop on Amazon, anything, apply for a loan, all of the above, look for a job. And that's what's happening now, is that AI permeates across all industries. And I think the challenge for us now too is to ensure that everybody understands what's happening.
That's a really good point. Does anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I could add a little bit, although I'm in academia and not in industry, but I think the same thing is happening in scientific research as well. We have been using AI ubiquitously to help us solve problems that we weren't able to solve before. And artificial intelligence always has this ethos associated with it that it can do magic. It can simply just do what you mean. It's artificial and it's intelligence, right? So we have spent many, many decades in academia, in industry, and as of late also in government, trying to figure out how to get AI to do everything under the sun, right? So we want to use it to do anything that it can do. But right now we are starting to ask the question of whether we should be asking it to do particular types of things. So we are now hopefully ready to move away from this kind of Wild West mentality of, being just very opportunistic with these technologies and thinking what it should or shouldn't be doing for us.
How do we move into that space? How do we move into asking those sorts of questions of what we should and shouldn't be doing with AI? It was something that I had on my list to ask later, but I feel like this is a good time to just go right into it.
I can maybe jump in here as the social scientist who has the pleasure of teaching at an engineering school. So I'm also at the Tandon School of Engineering. And I think what is really important to start the conversation is really focusing on developing the sort of social and technical literacy that Susan started talking about, and doing that with a view for equitability and justice. And first of all, acknowledge that there is no easy fix. Julia just pointed to that as well. There is no easy answer to these very thorny questions. And what I tell my students very often is that we all kind of need to commit to, wanting to sit with that tension that comes with acknowledging that, and try to have a conversation about how we can move towards a socio-technical future that is really for everybody and not just for the few. And that starts with acknowledging that there are these systematic features of oppression that are scaled up or can be scaled up through artificial intelligence, and flip that script a little bit. But that's a long that's a long road, and we're starting. So I'm very excited about this conversation, also the other conversations that we're having at the Center for Responsible AI and elsewhere, to bring everybody in, because it's everywhere.
Well, I think it's interesting
Sorry.
also you brought this up, because just in the last few days, in fact, I've been seeing articles and the headline is AI that seems more real, or AI that's more human-like, and I don't know if that's supposed to help the conversation, but I think it comes down to, so for example, in the past, let's say, someone goes to apply for a loan and you talk to the loan officer, and especially someone, from marginalized communities explains their story, and maybe they, they're not buying the Lexus, but they're on time with their car payments, right? And they have an opportunity to have this dialogue about why they need the loan and why they qualify, but that's not happening now. So in a lot of the AI tools now, when it comes to loans, for example, the AI tool will know how many mistakes a person made, what their shopping habits are they paying their bills on time, everything around their digital footprint. And what's scary about that type of thing is that, marginalized communities use their mobile devices, over-index on mobile devices. So by human nature, someone filling out an application for a loan on their mobile device is going to make more mistakes. But these AI tools will ding them for that, right? And understand, well, how many times did they make a mistake? How many times did they fix it? So by the time that the tool gets to the decision-making point, there is no story to be told. There is no human interaction. And I think looking ahead, those are the kinds of things that we need to address. And someone mentioned earlier about facial, or Rachel, you mentioned about facial recognition. Yeah, we know a lot of things are happening around that, but a lot of things are happening around and across a lot of different areas, right? And I think that this type of example is just one of the things that hopefully can be fixed in the room at the table of the tech companies that are creating the tools, and just like stop and think. So like, well, what algorithm needs to be added to consider whether it's someone's using a mobile device? I mean, I don't know, but those are the kinds of things that are coming up.
So let's talk a little bit more about that then. What should a company's, or maybe we could even broaden it to a company or perhaps even an academic lab's approach be when it comes to the design of AI that is responsible? Like at what stage in product design should a company or a lab think about responsible AI, and what should that even mean?
Well, I'll add, just because there have been a lot of great points raised on why AI, why do we see it everywhere? And I think to what Susan said, a little bit of it is we have lots of data available to us at this point in time, and we're able to process it. But also, as the others have said, it's really important to just remember that we still got to do the basics. We still have to ask the questions. Why are we building this? And so when you ask why, that means you've got to start at the beginning. And so thinking about developing AI responsibly is important to do that at the beginning. Just in our work with accessibility, with people with disabilities, it can't be a bolt-on. You can't wait until later. And if we're truly being innovative, that cycle of innovation starts with really addressing and thinking about a human need that we're solving and how technology can really help that. And then this sort of progress cycle where we're really using the experiences of people, like people with disabilities, to help us and give us that feedback. So I always say we've got to start with those basics that don't change just because we're talking about AI, but have to be grounded in what are we solving for? What human needs are we solving? And are we using humans to solve those needs?
Well, and I think too, it's about perspective, right? So we know there's a problem or a challenge with diversity in tech, and we know that's real. And a lot of people are working on that, and that needs to change. But as we speak, for the most part, there are not a lot of perspectives at the development table. And that's where it needs to start, right? I mean, I know what it's like in tech. It's about ship product, get it out the door, competitors, right? Well, companies aren't going to want to slow down. But what's happening is that they're speeding up, they're getting products out the door. And it just happened, not too long ago, where companies had to pull back facial recognition tools because of their failure rate. So I think if for example, a development team looks around and they acknowledge, and to Heather's point, like, well, first of all, what is this and what is a human need? But also, wow, this could potentially really impact the accessibility community. Do we have that perspective at the table? And if not, then maybe it's time to change the paradigm and call upon someone like a Heather, right? To bring that perspective in as the tool is being developed. I think that's where this dialogue needs to shift into, like, who's at the table? And if they're not there, then find them.
And if I may add to this, so I agree with what Heather and Susan said, and in particular that we need to think about responsibility early and often, right? So we need to think about it from the start when we are even deciding whether to put an algorithmic system in place to help people make decisions or to replace human decision-making altogether. But another important decision point is when we do decide to develop an algorithmic tool, we need to have a diversity of opinions in understanding what objectives this system is being asked to optimize for. What does it mean for the system to work? And who says that the system works or it doesn't work, right? So one thing that's very, very important to remember, and this is part of demystifying AI, so as to return power and agency to all of us to control it, is that algorithmic systems that use data, that operate with the help of rules that are either given ahead of time or that are derived from this data in some sense, they all are engineering artifacts and they work to specification. And so what you ask it to do, what specification you give to it, is of enormous importance. We can't just tell it to do what we mean. It doesn't know what we mean. And so we should also be in the habit of testing these machines, these algorithmic systems, to make sure that they in fact work to specification, that they are valid implementations of the goals that we have set out to fulfill.
Mona, did you want to add something too?
Yeah, although I'm pretty sure that we'll probably get to that a little later as well, which is, we talk a lot about bringing people to the table, but I think what we also need to talk about who sets the terms for sitting at the table, and how are we actually, are you just at the table or actually having dinner with everybody? So
That's a really good point.
What are the kinds of sort of conditions of being at the table that are different for different communities? And I really think that, especially over the last years, we have seen how the tech industry has a lot of catching up to do in that space. And I just want to, mention the firing of Dr. Timothy Gebru from the Google ethics team. So what are the kinds of, terms of participation? It's not enough to just be at the table. There are social and cultural structures that need to be changed. Otherwise, we will see a repeat.
Sure. Or not just how do you get there, but how do you get there and then stay there, and make sure that your voice is heard. That's a really good point. And maybe that leads us to the next thing that I wanted to ask all of you, which is, what are some examples of companies or government groups, labs that are doing this stuff well right now, and on the other end that you think are doing this poorly?
Well, I couldn't even name anybody that's doing it well. I think some people are trying, but
that's okay. I mean, that's kind of sucks, but like, it's also, that's that's honest.
But I think, what it comes down to is what we were just talking about, is that's the difference between diversity and inclusion, right? So diversity is, yes, hire somebody, yes, check the box, kind of like what Mona was saying. Okay, we have this number of people on our team. That's diversity. But inclusion, it's like having a party, inviting people, but inclusion is asking them to dance, right? So like, that's the next step. Like, what are we doing to actually have more inclusivity around the conversations within the development phase, right? Within the companies that you're speaking to, Rachel. But again, and my focus is, and how do we create more inclusivity in the communities that are often left out, right? So how do we create more social equity within AI, and that's a different type of conversation, but they all dovetail, on each other. But hopefully the next time we meet, whenever that might be, that we can all name off all kinds of companies that are doing some great things in this space. But I think it's moved so quickly, and let's not forget, in a post-COVID environment, everything is accelerated. The Tysons and all these companies have already said, yeah, we learned from COVID. We lost a lot of business because a lot of people got sick, and we are increasing our robotics. And nobody's talking about, like, well, what does that look like? Are there training programs? Is there a phased-in approach? So there's so many facets to what inclusivity could look like, but ultimately it does start at the tech company.
So, if I may chime in, so I'm an engineer, right? And I can give you an engineering perspective and give some actual concrete examples of where AI systems are working really well. We very often, when we say that the system is an AI system, we think that these are machine learning systems, that they learn from data. But that does not encompass the diversity and richness of AI. So the classical AI tools are rule-based. And a typical example of a very successful rule-based AI is Roomba, the vacuum, the autonomous vacuum, right? So it's based on rules, it's based on planning. It has a strategy that is implemented that tells it how to explore a room that it may not have seen before, when to go left, when to go right, when to turn around. And the reason that this tool works so well, and this actual robot works so well, is that the criteria are very well specified, and we have made algorithmic advances as a community to make it so that planning works very well and seamlessly. Another example of a very successful AI is various chess playing and Go playing machines, right? So Deep Blue, for example, you might remember, that IBM produced and that in 1997 beat Garry Kasparov, the legendary world champion in chess, at his game. And since Deep Blue, there have been other developments. For example, AlphaZero is another chess playing AI that uses a combination of rules and data-driven analysis. So it both learns and it adjusts and it incorporates the rules that it knows. And one of the really cool things about AlphaZero is that it was able to teach itself chess sufficiently well, again, to play at a grandmaster level, starting from basic rules and then just playing lots of games. So this is the power. And here again, the reason that these tools work so well is because we have amazing algorithmic insights, we have amazing computational power. Lots of really smart people spent a lot of time designing the tools and the algorithms here. And also the context of use and the definition of success is very, very clear. Now, there are other tools that we can also consider to be successful technically. But the difficulty with these tools is understanding how to make them succeed in a very difficult, thorny, controversial context of use. So for example, facial recognition tools. In principle, given enough data, you can train an AI, you can train a machine learning algorithm to be able to tell apart people very precisely, right? So from the point of view of an engineering artifact, it works really well. But where this breaks down, of course, is the most important point, and that is what are some legitimate uses for such a tool? Is it actually going to be used for good? Can we control its potential uses that are not so great, right? Surveillance. And this is where the success really breaks. And so again, it's back to this, what are the objectives? What are we asking these tools to do? Are we asking them to enable surveillance? Are we asking them to predict social outcomes? And this is something that arguably cannot be done, right? Because people have agency. We are not going to behave the way we've always behaved and the way people like us behave, because we're unique. We want to be able to make a choice. So again, from the engineering point of view, we can do a lot. The difficulty is where it hits society and context of use.
Well, I've heard a lot about the challenges in data sets, right? So I ask AI engineers, so it's like, what's happening? Like, what's the biggest challenge as you're creating these tools? And they keep, the explanation I hear is data sets. And so, and then my next question is, well, then how do we increase data sets in order for these tools to be created? Like what Julia speaking to these amazing tools, but with more data. And I don't know, Julia, if you could even explain a little more about that, So from what I understand, a lot of these pitfalls around some of the tools that have been created to date is because they've just been created based on limited data sets. And I would just like to understand from the others, do you feel that is the biggest hurdle, or what's your perspective?
So I'm happy to respond to this, and then I'll cede the floor. So this is one of the things that we hear most commonly, right? That there is bias in AI, there is bias in these models, in the rules essentially that these machines pick up from data, because data itself is biased. And people very rarely think precisely about what specifically they mean by that. And there are multiple interpretations of there being bias in the data. But essentially what we mean is that somehow data is not representative either of the world such as it is, or of the world that could or should be, right? So if we don't have enough women in the workforce, in the technical workforce, or if we don't have enough people of color in executive positions at companies, then we cannot learn a model that is fair in the sense of demographic representation from historical data. And so although that data may be perfectly representative of the world that is today, we are not going to be able to use it to predict and create a better world, right? Because when you learn from data and you make future decisions based on those models that you learned, it's a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it can even amplify the disparities that we observe. And having more data does not necessarily help. Very often we just need different data. And an example of there being too much data and that hurting us further is when we collect data in the context of policing, predictive policing, for example, when we over-police particular neighborhoods, and then therefore we send more patrol cars to those same neighborhoods, and they are going to be making more arrests in those neighborhoods, that oversaturates and overrepresents a particular area. So just having more data won't help. And another issue here is that when we deal with technology and with data as a kind of technological artifact, we have this sense as people that the decisions being made are objective in some sense, that an algorithm can tell us what's right, that a data set can tell us what really is in the world. But a data set is limited, right? It does not know what it doesn't know. And so there's only so much that we can do with the help of these interventions and collecting more data yet, and interrogating it until it gives up, or until it gives us the answer that we expect it to give. We have to step back always and to actually think as people what it is that we're expecting from these data sets, what are the corrections that we want to embed, and then direct our technical interventions in that vein.
I'll add that.
Oh, sorry, Heather, go on.
Oh, inclusive data sets is really crucial when we think about how to innovate for accessibility. We like to say that there is a data desert when it comes to the number of inclusive data sets that are representative of the lived experiences of people with disabilities. And Julia also mentioned a really great point, and I love that you brought this up, which is just one of the principles that I also talk about when designing inclusive AI, which is that it's important to balance intelligence with discovery. When we think about, modeling data based on history in order to make predictions, it's important that we remember that history hasn't necessarily served marginalized communities well, whether that's people of color or people with disabilities. And so it does kind of go back to what we talked about at the beginning. Well, what are you building? Are you really trying to replicate history? Could we build something new? And I just think there's such a great opportunity to do that. At least that's what I'm seeing in the accessibility space. The program that I'm part of, Microsoft AI for Accessibility program, provides grants to innovators all over the world that are trying to leverage AI to build solutions for people with disabilities. And one of our focus areas is employment. And that's because the unemployment rate for people with disabilities has been stagnant for 30 years, since we started counting. To me, that is a prime time for us to look at new solutions that can disrupt what has been. I mean, when we're looking at unemployment rates of 50 to 80% for people with disabilities compared to people without disabilities, we are in need of solutions. And so thinking about, again, what could be in the future in terms of what AI provides to us in terms of new opportunities and ways to rethink what has been, I think is one of the good things about AI.
Well, I think it's fascinating. I was reading that 90% of today's data has been created in the last 3 years. And that's kind of a little frightening. And then at the same time, I'm noticed, the more I read about data, and then let's say I go to a new website the other day to order something that I've never ordered before, and then they're asking all kinds of questions that are so not necessary for that one blouse that I ordered. But in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, this is all about capturing more data. You just see it everywhere.
Let's talk a little bit about inclusivity. How can we build AI that is more inclusive of either people who may have disabilities, inclusive of communities of color, inclusive of women? How do we even think about approaching that?
Well, go ahead, Heather.
Getting off mute there. Love that technology there. I think it's a lot about what Mona said, which is how are we empowering people when we bring them to the table? Particularly for our program, we're making investments on innovations that are going to push us globally to think about how to include people with disabilities and how to provide more opportunities for independence. And so when I think about that, one of our principles is that we have to fund things that are rooted in the communities that they serve. None of this for us. The disability community has a saying, nothing about us without us. And so really that literacy piece that we talked about at the beginning, as well as sharing what does AI mean? How does it work? I am big on that, but also empowering them. Here are the tools, here's the technology. And in our case, there's also grants of money and data science skills that may be available. But these are communities that know their communities best. They know the needs that technology can solve. And so by equipping them and empowering them, then we just come alongside the work that they are doing and amplifying that work.
Yeah, I think one way also is to amplify the work of the new generation of AI leaders. And there's this entire large group, not large given the whole ecosystem, but those that came in that started Black in AI, Latinx in AI, women machine learning has been around a bit, queer in AI. And these are the young, incredibly smart PhDs now that are the future leaders, right? And so one of the things that we're doing at AINU is highlighting these young leaders with our podcasts and videos for two reasons. One is to help them internally, because I know firsthand how difficult it is to be a person of color in tech, but two, to also use their voices to teach our communities about AI. So, we'll be going to the National Urban League, for example, and having Black and AI leaders talk about the fundamentals. Let's just start with AI 101, very basic, and work from there. But I think over time, it's more than a single track, right? It's a dual approach of educating the community, but then at the same time also helping those new leaders that are women, from the accessibility community, from communities of color, and help elevate them within their own tech companies to help them have a bigger voice.
Can I just chime in here real quick? And I just want to really second everything that Heather said, and I'm so glad you brought up nothing about us without us. And I, again, want to come in as an educator and really make very, very clear that the next generation of technologists is very, very ready to do this work and is demanding that work. So we're actually at a point where we need to call on industry and on policymakers to provide the kinds of jobs, the kind of spaces, the kinds of resources, the funding to do this work. These kids are coming to me every day and asking me, where can I apply to do this work of technology in the public interest? And I think we're going to see, hopefully, a major shift in sort of the private public landscape based on what is happening. And I really hope that, or I will say that, you know, the organizations who like get that first, they're gonna get the best talent. That's where they're gonna go.
Let's talk a little bit about sort of going off of that, the idea of regulating AI systems and regulations related to AI. There isn't a ton of regulation in the US in particular related to AI. And I don't know, to me, I guess it's surprising, but not that surprising, because it seems like with technology in general, there's like it takes a long time for rule of law to kind of catch up. I'm just kind of curious what you all think about how we should regulate either specific applications of this technology or AI in general. Julia, I know you in particular recently wrote about this in a New York Times opinion piece about legislation to stamp out racism and sexism in hiring technology.
Yes, thank you. The regulation is one of my favorite topics, as a matter of fact, and it's surprising, I think, to hear from a technologist and an engineer, but we engineers, we want to build things and fix things, right? And this is a blessing and a curse. And so for me, at some point, a realization came that to make things better, it's not more technology that we should be building, but rather we should be building in the brakes into these cars that we are creating, right? Because we have all these cars racing and they just cannot brake other than by hitting a wall. And then periodically we hit these walls and then there's a lot of uproar, and rightfully so, right? So in the last few years, there has not been an opportunity to regulate the use of technology at the federal level. However, a lot of work has been going on in cities and in states. And in particular, in New York City, we have been very fortunate to have a kind of a critical mass of community groups, of academics, and also of regulators being receptive to this narrative that we need to start overseeing the use of technology. And so New York City has made several attempts. The most recent one, thank you, Rachel, for mentioning the op-ed, is our attempts in New York to regulate the use of algorithmic hiring tools. And the idea there is that we want to come up with an approach that combines auditing of some sort. Auditing of the tools for bias is what the current proposed law speaks about. But many of us think that that should be augmented to also include auditing for validity. Does the tool work, in fact? And then there is also a very strong component that speaks to public disclosure. So job seekers, for example, would have to be notified that they were evaluated with the help of a tool, either alone or a tool and a human. And they would have to be told what characteristics of their application the tool considered. And I think that this would be extremely powerful if, in fact, we're able to explain these characteristics in a way that don't just check a box, but that really explain to a person what's happening, to allow them to contest the practice, to contest what data the system is using, but also to know what exam they should take, or what other intervention, what else they can do themselves in order to be more competitive for a job of this sort in the future. So I'm really thrilled that New York City once again is attempting to move the needle on regulation of AI. And I think that we need to start to be successful. We need to start with specific industries with specific use cases that are interesting and important and controversial, to be able to build precedent and an understanding of how to actually go about regulating these tools in general. And part of this, of course, is education, but this is something that others have spoken to, and we can continue if you guys would like. But public education and education of policymakers, both are very necessary to be successful here.
Julia brings up such a great point about policy at the local level. I can just share just insight at the federal level. There are a lot of conversations, right? And those need to happen. I was joining an AI roundtable hosted by some members of the Congressional Black Caucus. This was last year. And we're up on Capitol Hill, and there are a number of congressional members, not just from the Black Caucus, but from other caucuses at the table. And they literally could not agree on what committee AI would sit on, like who has jurisdiction. They could not agree because they said, well, no, it's not privacy, it's not energy and commerce, where exactly would this start? And I'm telling you, when I walked out of the room, I just shook my head and I thought, oh my goodness, if this is our starting point, it's a while before we see some federal activity. Maybe they pull it together with the changes, but at the time, I think that's a starting point. So it's a long way from the federal perspective, it appears. But we are seeing more activity at the state level.
Can I just chime in here?
Sorry. No, it's okay. I was going to say, does anyone else want to chime in?
I just want to chime in here real quick and sort of second what's been said, but also say that as a European, I am really excited about the possibility of a, global discourse around regulatory advances. And I really do think that this will actually happen more on the local level, at least initially. We're seeing that, as Julia said, in New York City, where there are like really decided advances in that space that are also very grounded in, literacy projects and advocacy and groups who are really pushing out the boat. But I think that we're gonna see, hopefully, I mean, that's what I'm sort of also observing as a social scientist, a problem or case or application or industry focus, as Julia described it, exchange on these issues. So we're gonna, not least because these tools are deployed globally. Fortune 500 companies use these tools for applicants around the globe, for example, if we talk about hiring, right? So we're gonna sort of see folks come together here. And whilst I think it's extremely important to have this conversation at the federal level, I think initial advances and successes we'll see more locally. And I think this is where it's kind of a call, I'm calling on everybody to get involved in this stuff on a local level. You can actually, go to your city council meeting and hear and learn about that, what that stuff means in the space you live in. And so I think that's something everybody can do and should do probably at some point.
Let's talk a little bit about auditing AI systems that we've got. So we've already got an AI system. It's here. We might like it. We might not like it. What do we think of the idea of auditing them? What does it mean to do this? And can it help us lead to more equitable AI?
I think Mona should start. Mona has written on this extensively.
So we need audits. That's for sure. That is a very important part of trying to get to a place where we can say we have something that somewhat resembles, or at least has the, the goal of being an equitable technology. Do
you mind just really briefly explaining, if anybody isn't totally sure what auditing is, like what would auditing an AI system consist of?
Okay, so Rachel, that's actually a very difficult question, because that's where we don't actually have, and this is where the problem kind of currently sits. We don't have a agreed upon definition of what audit could mean. We don't even know, as Susan said, we don't even know what AI is, or Heather has talked about this at the moment as well. So what is happening?
That was a trick question.
That was a trick question, but that's okay.
Julia,
I see Julia.
I have a simple definition of audit. Check whether it works. That's an audit. That's what an audit does.
But then we probably have to define what works means,
and
right?
then we have to define what works, and then we have to define what it means to check, right? But yeah.
So we can also say what it shouldn't mean. It shouldn't mean, as a sort of self-assessment by companies. It shouldn't mean just sort of checking whether the algorithm, and I'm deliberately leaving out the works bit because we need to talk about the works bit. Does the algorithm do what it says it does? Because it might do, say that it does things that it shouldn't. It gets a bit complicated here. And then we also know that auditors need access, right? They need access to models, they need access to assumptions that get baked into the model, to data, and all these kinds of things. So it's a big sort of, ideally, a big project, but again, we need to be mindful of the fact that audits sort of come in post-deployment. So we also might want to talk about things like risk assessment that come in prior to deployment. But I would love to hear Heather and Julia also sort of speak to this as well.
Well, Julia is being very kind, so I'll just step in and briefly say that I agree with you, Mona. I do think that when I think of audit, I think of just ongoing testing. You both talked about, does it do what it says it's supposed to do? Also, I have a background in engineering, and I know sometimes you design something and then it does a couple other things later on that you didn't think people were going to use it for. And so that's why that continuing testing process with diverse users is really important. Certainly in Microsoft, we talk a lot about responsible AI, and that includes things like transparency, which I think is important because we're saying like, okay, does it work? But does someone on the team, can they explain how it works? What goes into the decision making? What was, reviewed in order to make it? And I think those things are really important when we think about systems, AI solutions that might determine benefits, disability benefits, for example, which we've certainly seen in the news. And so again, there are principles as well as always a need to check during design and after. But Julia, what would you say?
Yeah, I can add if it's helpful. So an audit is one particular step in establishing an accountability structure for the design, development, use of an algorithmic decision system or automated decision system. And these audits, checking whether the system works to specification is the way that I would define them. They can be checking against multiple types of objectives. So taking algorithmic hiring as an example here, because it's very difficult to speak in the abstract. What do we want these systems to do? We want them to actually be able to select candidates who will do well on the job. And we don't want them to discriminate. We don't want them to arbitrarily prioritize one candidate group over another, either because their names start with the letter A, and so alphabetically they're going to come first, or if they went to a particular set of colleges, for example, that are the kinds of colleges that current employees went to, and therefore we are not going to be hiring any people from, say, historically Black colleges and universities or from all women's colleges, but rather we will be hiring people only from the Ivy Leagues, right? So there are these two dimensions, and one is this auditing for bias and for potential discrimination that can happen if decisions of these systems are in fact enacted, right? And then there's auditing for whether they work. But an audit is not going to solve all of the problems that we have with respect to accountability. And to explain this, I'll bring up an example that I think, Heather, you will like, and that is discrimination against individuals with disabilities for the purpose of hiring. You can only audit, essentially, against characteristics that are reported in your data. And very often people who are living with disabilities are not going to disclose when they are applying for jobs that they are disabled, in part for fear of discrimination, for fear of then not being hired, right? So membership in protected groups will be missing very often from the data, and it is more likely that somebody who does belong to a protected group, a historically disadvantaged group, will not disclose that membership. And so that will prevent you from auditing for discrimination, potential discrimination against individuals with disabilities. Another problem with disabilities is that it's not a monolithic category, right? People experience disabilities in very, very different ways. And so an important component of this accountability structure that we are working to set up in hiring and then more broadly is a combination of auditing of some sort with public disclosure. Because then if an individual who is disabled sees a report from the company that did not hire them, and that report says, we didn't hire you because you couldn't quickly enough tell apart the red squares from the green squares on the screen. And it's a kind of a dumb example, right? But then they will speak up and they'll say, first of all, this is discriminatory because I'm colorblind. So you're discriminating against me with this test. And secondly, why is this even job relevant, right? So the kind of power that we can get to hold these systems to account that public disclosure will give us is something that we can never derive from audits alone, even if they are done properly. But again, this is not to say that we shouldn't be auditing. We absolutely must. And the question is going to be, how do we establish these criteria against which to audit? And this has to be with public input.
Let's turn on that note. Let's turn to an audience question, a different kind of public input. One of the questions that we have here is how much of this is an issue as it relates to, I think we're talking about equity in AI. How much of this is an issue as it relates to the data collected and the historical issues of the types of data collected versus the actual AI or algorithm used? That's a tough one.
Well, I think we touched on that briefly. I don't know if it was Julia or somebody touched on that earlier about, or maybe it was Heather. If tools are being created based on data from the past, by its very nature, it may be biased intrinsically, right? The patterns repeat themselves. I guess is what the story is, right? So, to me, that just seems like one of the challenges. I don't know how we overcome that. Maybe Julia and Heather can speak to that more.
I'm happy to speak up here as well. So first of all, I don't think it's very important for us when we reason about these systems misbehaving to try and decouple really what is the effect of the data versus what is the effect of the model itself that is learned from the data. Because a model is going to be a representation of the data that you give it. And in very many cases, just the model itself, by the technical properties of it, is going to try to amplify the disparities if there are disparities in the data. But this is a little bit beside the point. So for us to be able to mitigate bias, we need to understand what kinds there are. And for this, I really like to invoke this categorization that is due to Batya Friedman and Helen Nissenbaum that appeared in their 1996 paper called Bias in Computer Systems. And it's as relevant today as it was in 96. And so the way that they categorize bias is into pre-existing, technical, and emergent. Pre-existing bias is what we mean when we say that there's bias in the data. It's that there was something in society that was going wrong somehow, and then that discriminatory past is reflected in the data. The data is then fed into the technical system, and biased decisions are coming out. Technical bias is a very interesting component of bias that we rarely discuss. And this is actually the kind of bias that we have much more of an opportunity to mitigate with the help of engineering interventions. So this is when bias is introduced by the operation of the technical system itself. And it very often exacerbates the effects of pre-existing bias. So an example here, I already mentioned a little bit, is when data is missing, not at random, as we say. When data is more likely to be missing, for example, about demographic group membership from people who are members of historically disadvantaged groups. And then in your algorithm, in your technical system, you're going to be trying very often to guess, to fill in those missing values. And if you don't think about why data is missing, if you assume that it's just missing at random, it's equally as likely to be missing for somebody who isn't disabled. You'll be filling in those values incorrectly. You'll be taking the most common value in the data set. And so you will turn everybody who is disabled but didn't say they were into a fully able person. You will turn every woman who declines to state their gender into a man, if men are the predominant demographic. And if you think about age discrimination in hiring, you would know that people who are older will be less likely to disclose their age. And if you guess the values for their age, you will make them skew younger than they actually are, and then you will be offering them lower salaries, right? Because salary does correlate with age. The third type of bias that is extremely important, and this is the one that is very difficult to capture, to measure, and to counteract, is called emergent bias. And it arises when your system itself is changing society in such a way as to amplify these disparate effects. So feedback loops, predictive policing that is making us deploy yet more cars to over-policed neighborhoods, and then that feeds into the data. This is an example of emergent bias. It's something that happens outside of the system's control. And specifically for emergent bias, it's extremely important for us to hear from communities being affected, to be detecting it, and to be going back to the drawing table, essentially, and thinking about ways to mitigate.
One other question that we have here is that's related to that, and we've touched on it a bit, but I think it'd be cool to go into it a little more, is if the data that many of these algorithms use it already reflects bias, all different kinds of bias, what are the ways that can be addressed so that the decisions being made by AI don't also reflect that bias? Can you fix a system? Do you have to just scrap a system? How do we work on that?
I'll quickly say we don't expect the system to fix itself. So we need to make sure that I say that, but in all seriousness, we need to then enlist people to actually help and reduce that bias. And so I also love that question too, because you are recognizing that there is bias. So many times it's like, oh, okay, if there's bias in the system, we're going to get rid of that one. And Julia's already done a great job of just talking about how these things are existing, whether pre-existent or emergent from the technology. But again, if we take a human-centered approach, if we know that it's there, then let's reduce it and mitigate it by enlisting people to do that.
Okay. One other question we have here, it's a little bit different, is can companies use an opt-in method to protect customers from the privacy issues associated with the AI? Anybody want to tackle that one? Mona, did you want to tackle that one?
Just really briefly, again, from a European perspective, with the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, that probably all of you are familiar with who go onto European sites. The GDPR is heavily based on the idea of opt-in, of consent, and that's great. But when we sort of square that with how we live our social lives every day, we just opt in. So we're not necessarily talking about an informed decision about consent, because our socio-technical infrastructure is so deeply, intertwined with having to give consent. And then we add on literacy issues, and on and on and on and on and on it goes. So I think opt-in is the start of a conversation about things like data rights and what we just talked about, equitable tech. I don't think we can actually solve anything with that, and the GDPR shows that.
Does anybody else want to chime in on that one? Thank you, Mona. That was really helpful. Okay, let's go to the next one. There's a couple more questions here. Another one, and I have a feeling I know what a lot of your answers are going to be, is should we be afraid of all the data that gets collected? I assume that means that data that's collected about all of us, anyone who's using the internet in any meaningful sense.
I'm not so sure about being afraid of it. I think being very aware, because as I mentioned earlier, now whoever is participating in this event, now watch the next time you go to order something and you're asked for, like, why do you need my phone number and why do you need this, when I'm just sending a gift card to somebody. I think it's about being aware, right? And also, especially for the marginalized communities, being aware of your digital footprint and how that follows you everywhere. And I think that there's a real gap in people understanding that the impact that their digital footprint can have on their everyday lives.
And if I could just add in that awareness as individuals, I think also being aware as companies as well of how people might feel in sharing data. And so respecting that and thinking through that process is important. Julia already talked about, the fact that some folks aren't comfortable disclosing their disability. 70% of disabilities are actually non-apparent. And so we know as a company that perhaps an individual isn't comfortable sharing personal or certain data with companies or the government, but yet they might be more comfortable with a nonprofit. And so I think that's where collaboration in the community in order to collect data and also be very transparent with consent is important.
If I may add here, so data is a syntactic kind of a thing, right? I don't think we should be afraid of data. We should be afraid of how it could be used. And it is indeed a scary world, and no data can be assumed to be harmless by default. There are many examples of, governments coming into power, changing the political system drastically, and then, going after particular demographic groups. I mean, a striking example of this is, of course, Jews being prosecuted in Nazi Germany because the government had records of which families are Jewish. And this was something that was unthinkable to these families just a few years prior. So making sure that we as individuals have control over not only what data is collected, but how that data is used, and being able to opt out of particular uses of the data, I think is absolutely crucial. And so when these data collection and data analysis mechanisms are designed, and when we regulate them, we have to always think about stakeholders, right? I mean, it's a kind of a common sense reasoning. Who are the stakeholders? Who benefits from this data collection and who is harmed? And is it the case that it's always the same people who are harmed and always the same other people who benefit? So again, there's plenty of precedent historically of this in fact being the case. And then I think that we need to be always very worried and very much demanding to stay in control of our data.
I think I have a good question for us to end on. This one is, what do you think, and this is something, if each of you can answer, that would be awesome. What do you think is the most groundbreaking or helpful technology or policy that has helped to make AI more responsible or more ethical?
Does it have to be a technology or a policy?
Right.
Well, if you got a better answer, go for it.
I don't want to start, sorry.
Okay, well then I'll just hop in.
Okay.
One of my favorite projects, it's not a policy, but one of my favorite projects is with researchers at Vanderbilt, where they're building a virtual job coach for people with autism to just aid in the interviewing process. And what I love is that this job coach is getting data. It's looking at stress levels, it's looking at eye gaze of the candidate and adjusting the interview if it detects stress. And the reason why I love that example is because it is using technology to kind of shift instead of asking the person with the disability to shift. And so when I think of innovation and what could be, I think of examples like that are really great for us to have conversations around about how we could do things better.
That's really interesting. I don't think I had heard of that. And it's a really interesting sort of mental model to mold, like in your mind, thinking, well, why are we expecting people to adapt to technology? Shouldn't technology adapt to us? Wouldn't that be more ideal? Did anybody have anything else they wanted to add? Susan, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think of in health and medicine, right? So for example, there are some AI tools now that can help people with diabetes. You don't have to measure their own glucose. That these tools, this bracelet or this band, this watch band will do that. So I think over time, hopefully that some of these tools can be more affordable. Only like the top insurance companies will cover them now. But I think over time, there will be a lot of great advancements in medicine that can help all communities.
I have another thought here, and that it's not a technology really, but my favorite thing that has happened lately in tech, and in particular in AI, is that ethics has become part of the mainstream conversation. And I think that this is really exciting. It's very necessary, absolutely, but it's also very exciting for a number of reasons. One of these is that now we almost for free get a much more diverse and engaged set of students looking at computer science and data science topics. since I've been teaching responsible data science at NYU, I have been getting a much more diverse group of students in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of socioeconomic backgrounds. And this is really, really exciting. So we are, I think, looking at the right problems because we're starting to get a much better set of people at the table. And another thing that has happened recently, and this is a little bit of a self-serving comment, I'm sorry, but I have realized, and several people have realized, that one way for us to start wrapping our heads around technology ethics is by bringing humor into the conversation, art and humor. And this perhaps is the main difference between people and machines. Machines don't have a sense of humor. They don't have an appreciation for art, and we do. And so I think that we should be looking for creative ways in which we communicate these intimidating, complex topics among ourselves, to members of the public, to policymakers, really to everybody. And so we've been working together with the very talented Fala Arif Khan. We have been developing comic book series on responsible AI for different types of audiences. And I encourage all of you and all of us to think about other creative ways to express these complex, important, intimidating contexts and ideas.
That's very cool. I want to check that out. Did anybody else Mona, did you want to add something?
I kind of, everybody's always such a hard act to follow. But I will say something along the lines of what Julia said, which is that I am extremely excited about the interdisciplinary conversations that we're having. And I'm extremely excited about the next generation critically looking at power and oppression, but with a view for a better future and with a real zest for changing things. And I'm going to say it again, we should watch out. They're ready. They are ready to go. And I'm really excited to see what's going to happen off the back of what everybody has just said.
Thank you all so much for your time. And thank you everybody who is listening and watching. It was so great to speak with all of you women. And yeah, thanks very much. And that about wraps it up for us.
Thank you
so much. Bye.